Good evening, everybody. I'm so happy to welcome you here tonight for this artist talk with Elizabeth Alexander. My name is Carolyn Almendinger. I'm Director of Education and Interpretation at the Ackland. And the event, tonight's event is presented in connection with the Art Bridges Collection Loan Partnership, which brought several works of art of American art to the Ackland Art Museum from the Crystal Bridges Museum of Art in Arkansas, including Elizabeth's work, Spit Cake, which I hope many of you have already had the chance to look at. It is on view in our galleries if you turn left outside of this gallery and head back to our Gallery of Modern and Contemporary Art. It's on view there. It's also featured on our online feature called Close Looks, so you can have a look at it there as well. And I encourage you to do both, actually, while you can. We're so thrilled to welcome Elizabeth to Chapel Hill from Massachusetts, where she currently serves as Assistant Professor and Sculpture Department Coordinator at Montserrat College of Art in Boston. Alexander holds a BFA from Massachusetts College of Art and an MFA from the Cranbrook Academy. Her work is interdisciplinary, from sculptures to installations, and it's been shown across the country at institutions that include the Museum of Art and Design, the National Museum of Women in the Arts, the Nasher Museum of Art, our neighboring museum over in Durham at that other university, and the Southeastern Center for Contemporary Art. So she's familiar with North Carolina as well. Her work is included in the permanent collection of Crystal Bridges, which is how it came to be here with us, and the Mint Museum of Art. In addition to the work on view at the Ackland, you may have also seen her work on view at the North Carolina Museum of Art as part of their collection reinstallation that opened last fall. And you'll also have another chance to see her work in the Triangle at an upcoming exhibition at Castle House this May. We're so happy to have you here on campus, Elizabeth. And this is where I'll just step in and add a small plug for any students who may be in the audience, or anyone who knows students who aren't yet in the audience, that you still have time to join a hands-on workshop with Elizabeth tomorrow afternoon at 3:30 here at the Ackland. So for now, however, that's tomorrow. So for now, please join me in welcoming Elizabeth.
Everyone, thank you so much for coming. Thank you to the Ackland for inviting me. This is a big honor. I recently moved to Massachusetts, having been a North Carolina resident in Winston-Salem for about 7 years, and so it's a little bit of a homecoming, home away from homecoming, I guess. So it's a big honor to be here. And it's also exciting to see Spit Cake, because I haven't actually seen that object in at least 10 years. So it's nice to see it now. 10 years? Maybe 8. I don't know, a while. All the years have doubled and tripled since the pandemic started, right? So what's a year anymore? Anyway, so I'm really pleased to be here. I want to start my talk, which I will be focusing mostly on the cut porcelainware that I do that led to Spit Cake, and other works that I've done since then that incorporate those same skills, and then work around that puts it into context. However, I'm going to start talking about when I was about 7 years old, and I cut into my parents' brand new couch and love seat. This was not it, but I grew up in a working class household. My parents were 19 and 20 when I was born. My father is a steel fabricator, and he started his business when he was about 20, so right around when I was born. And so I kind of grew up in this steel fabrication business. My mom is an artist, and resources were scarce. So everything in the house was hand-me-downs, upcycled objects, which that wasn't really a word yet, trades with people, handmade. My mom made all the curtains slip-covered everything in the house. And so I grew up in an environment of resourcefulness, and that did sort of teach me a very specific relationship to objects, to found objects, that you will notice I've carried on through my entire life. That also meant that once they got brand new furniture for the first time, there were different rules. Suddenly, couldn't eat on the couch. Suddenly, you couldn't stand on the furniture. You couldn't play near the furniture. It was the 80s. They were very young. A white couch and love seat with 3 kids in the house was doomed from the start. But I wanted to know what made these objects so special. And so from the outside, they looked very normal. They looked like a regular old couch and love seat. Surely the special stuff was inside, right? So I took a pair of scissors and I cut about a 1 to 2 inch slice into the arm of I can't remember if it was a couch or love seat, and saw that there was fluff inside, which didn't look that cool. So proceeded to go on with my day, and then new rules were made around the furniture. But there's a lot of studies in philosophy around children and play and how children kind of learn about the world through acts like these sort of quasi-destructive acts. Erich Fromm stated in 1956, "The child takes something apart, breaks it up in order to know it. The cruelty itself is motivated by something deeper, the wish to know the secret of things and of life." And you will notice that I have basically built an entire career learning the secret of things and of life through this kind of exploration of deconstruction, deconstructing objects in my world. And my world is a fairly domestic one. So I use forms and materials typically associated with American domestic harmony to unpack the social, cultural, and psychological effects of idyllic domesticity, success, and safety. My interest in exploring the American values and idealism of home stem from that loving yet tumultuous upbringing that I mentioned before, working class upbringing, where our home was the center of our world. So our home was the source of much love and joy, but it was also the source or the location for some turbulent moments, some stress, etc. And so because of that, I think about what it might look like if the spaces we inhabit embodied our emotions and the more complicated elements of ourselves. Traditional crafts are combined with contemporary materials and digital tools to create work that can range from a disassembled teacup to a photo series of altered environments to site-specific installations with sound and performance. In some ways, I'm fighting back against these idyllic images of the home as a perfectly controlled kingdom and envisioning spaces that have this evidence of humanity. So taking these spaces that have a lot of order and maybe putting a little disorder, a little bit of unpredictability into those spaces through casting them, through paper assemblage, through deconstructing elements. I don't know if any of you were able to witness this piece, but this was at the Mint Museum, and so there was an installation on either side of a wall. So this video kind of captures what that might have been like in the space. Every artist, I think anybody who studies anything has almost a seed moment or a piece where they start to understand their brain a little bit better and their obsessions. So if you listen to an interview with a scientist, they might talk about, the first time they encountered the thing that they've spent their lives studying. Bellingrath Gardens and Home is that piece for me. So when I was in graduate school, this was about 2008, this was at the Cranbrook Academy of Art, I had pneumonia and was bedridden and bored, so bored. There's only so much binge watching TV. I don't think binge watching was a term yet. There's only so much you can do. So I had this book of formal gardens that Bell and Grath Gardens and Home, it's formal gardens in Alabama, that I think I took for an altered book project that I didn't do, and just proceeded to cut all the flowers out of the book just to have something to do. I really just was like, what would it look like if I took every flower out of this book? And I was trained as a sculptor, but with a crafts bent. So I worked a lot with ceramics, glass, casting metal. So I really regarded materials as raw materials. So I thought more about, when I worked with found materials, they were treated like they were a raw material. They were ground down to nothing and then built back up. It wouldn't even occur to me to leave anything intact in an image or in an object. So this piece, probably because I was sick and wasn't thinking and didn't care, I just didn't even worry about these subconscious rules that I had for myself about, how you work with found material, how you work with somebody else's imagery. But there was something really interesting that was happening. These heavily organized spaces were suddenly becoming kind of wild and disorganized and a little bit eaten away through just taking that one element out. It was really kind of profound to me to see how much something could change by removing one thing. So I was becoming more aware of the power in absence. You wouldn't be that aware of the absence of those flowers if I broke everything down and put it back together. The fact that I left things intact, you become aware of that absence. You have a question? Yeah.
So what you cut away, are we seeing the next page?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. So when I was working on this, because I was working in a book, I just was putting a little, I think it was about this big, a little cutting mat between the pages in bed. I literally would wake up with flowers stuck to my body because they were just in the bed. So when I was cutting them out, I left the pages intact in the book, mostly to keep track of everything. But I could see when things were, as I was cutting things away, I was creating windows that were viewing into the next page. So that was making these very unusual spaces. And the thing about, formal gardens is order, organizing nature, structure. All of these things are these kind of signifiers of success, of wealth, of status. If you can hire somebody to organize these things, if you can bring flowers from other lands to your garden and have them survive in a place that they're not native to, like that's all, that was all these status symbols. And so I was not thinking about this at the time. I was honestly just sick and trying to occupy my mind. But, over time, I've really been very drawn to how I was subtly kind of pushing against some of those elements through this one very simple act. Another thing that was going on at that time, I was in grad school, so I was going through critiques. Some of you, maybe, has anyone in this room gone through critiques before? Yeah, they can be stressful, right? I was so sick with pneumonia, but I was also really sick of being told. Decorative was a really dirty word at that time. I was being sick of told not to use flowers anymore. being steered away from this kind of draw that I had to decorative imagery, the sort of language of decorative arts in my work. Now it's, after Kehinde Wiley, I think there's more acceptance, but 2008 and earlier, I had, it was a common thing that came up in these critiques. And so I was like, well, I'll just take all the flowers out then. So there was a little bit of a rebellion in this. I was making this work for myself, and before I've decided that, before it turned into the seed piece that I mentioned, it was this moment of this kind of project just for myself. But this work led, sorry, I forgot that I put all of the gardens of my family into the talk. So gardens are a common thing in my family. So when people were telling me not to use flowers, it was actually, it was like telling me not to be myself, because this is my entire lineage. I also have a lot of farming in my background as well that will come up later. But so like growing things, watching things grow, watching the cycle of life is a big part of my world. So after Bellingrath Gardens and Home, I got better. I wanted to see what would happen if I could cut a chair. So I bought a chair. I was an adult now, I could buy a piece of furniture. But to see how it would look if I removed those florals from objects. At first, the chair didn't really work for me, and so I built a space around it. How could I make an environment as immersive as those images? And so I want to put first draft. Any makers out there, sometimes your first draft doesn't work. It's funny, it's fun. I titled it Keeping Up Appearances. I was thinking about the BBC comedy series, sitcom. And so I was thinking about this kind of kitschy, fun version of Keeping Up Appearances when I was creating that work. But really what was going on was it was 2008. I was in graduate school during the recession, and I was forward-looking into a very uncertain environment. I was also in graduate school in the middle of Pontiac and Detroit, Michigan, which were two of the hardest hit areas of the country. So thinking about home, thinking about the security of home wasn't all that easy for me. It was a fairly stressful idea. And all the arts jobs, everything wasn't, they were all dissolving in front of me. So I was looking into a future that just didn't look possible. So thinking about what keeping up appearances means, that changed a lot once I actually put it in the context of the times. Keeping up appearances in a time where you feel like your future is not working, or you feel like things are crumbling around you, is putting up a veneer of something. So I am the subject in these images. And so when I disengaged myself from the camera and was less aware of the space, thinking less about this camp image, I'm kind of caught in this act of deconstructing a space and then reconstructing the space. And you don't know, in the fourth slide, am I going to then put it back together again? Am I going to keep building? Or am I going to then just destroy what I just did and kind of work in this cycle? And so this piece, combined with Bellingrath Gardens and Home, you can kind of see are the source of pretty much any imagery that I've made since. And that, I think, is really important to kind of note, because this all started because I was sick and I wasn't thinking, and I was feeling really angsty about my critiques. One other thing that happened in this space was I was no longer cutting all of the soft material. I started to use those craft skills that I mentioned earlier and cut everything in the room, which included porcelainware and included kind of going back to my understanding of cold working glass. For this series, or for these pieces, I used a sandblaster, and someday I will have one powerful enough to be able to do this again. But I have, since then, this was 2008, it's 2013, I'm still cutting porcelain. I'm still finding new things. But there's something about these discrete objects that still, it holds the potency of that room. It holds the potency of that space that I find really pretty remarkable. And there's just unending possibilities in removing the floral content from these objects. Everyone asks me how I do it, so I included some images of process. And so what I'm doing, so I mentioned I used a sandblaster here, and I kind of adapted that to something that I can do with the equipment that I have access to. And that is the same process if you have crystal glasses or crystalware that have really beautiful patterns kind of etched into them. It's the same tools and processes that you would use for that. There's specific machines so you can get special shapes, but basically it's a spinning bit with diamonds on it, diamond grit, so it can get through the glass material, and you work in water. Whenever I tell people verbally that I work in water, I think they picture me in a wetsuit, in a tank, but I'm really just submerging the object into a tub and cutting the material. I'm working a little fast for the video, but because I'm aware that there's a video happening, but I'm just grinding the material in my path to remove all of this porcelain, all of the porcelain behind it. And it creates the noise is awful. It's like a dentist from hell. You are very glad I don't have the sound on this video. So I have noise-canceling earphones on. I wear a respirator. The water does keep the dust down, but I don't trust it, so I still wear a respirator because I don't want silicosis. And I wear a face shield and I wear a rubber apron to try to keep all the stuff down. And there's a lot of cleanup after. It's a very messy process to do something so delicate. It's such an aggressive, loud, messy process to make marks and make these cutouts that look so delicate. Some people don't want to touch the things. They don't want to look at it the wrong way because they think everything will just combust in front of them. It's actually fairly strong material. But I've been working with this for years, and I'll do things like I'll trace the pattern, but then I might see how far can I push the cut around this cup? How far can I do that and it'll still hold? So this one is actually held together with about 1 inch of porcelain near the handle, and that's it. Or sometimes things break, and so I'll glue them back together in different ways. Sometimes things break in the process. I think I dropped this one on my cement floor. But the thing about porcelain is if you have a handle, if you have a lip, you know what the object was. You don't really necessarily need it to look exactly the way that it was for it to conjure thoughts of these objects. I also think a lot about what these objects mean. So you think about porcelainware, and they were once, you think about wedding china, you think about these kind of symbols of success again, of delicacy, of leisure, of sitting and having tea, of serving people on a special occasion. And there's silent cues. If you know about certain patterns, you know the value of these objects even more than just the object in itself. If you know about the material, you know the value of these objects more than just the object in itself. And so I think a lot about the value we place on objects and how that in turn reflects the value back on us as people and how we value each other through the possession of objects sometimes, or how we might value ourselves through the possession of certain objects. And it doesn't mean special objects can't be special, but sometimes I think it can put a lot of pressure on people. And so objects like porcelainware, objects in the domestic sphere, being a cis working class woman, that is oftentimes sort of within my language of value that I've grown up learning through family or just the society I grew up in. And so I don't know if any of you were paying attention, but this teacup was intact in the corner of the first image that was on the screen. So they show up in different pieces. I'm working on a photo series that the teacup is intact, but I don't need it anymore for the photo series, so then I'll take it out and cut it up and have it be its own piece. But this was created in 2022. So this is a series that I add to every year. In different ways. Now to spit cake. Oh, the other thing, before I forget, the titles, except for spit cake, every piece is titled by the stamp on the bottom. Another one of those signifiers of the value of the object is the stamp on the bottom. So I title them with the stamp usually has the pattern name of what was on there. So the Florida was on the bottom of the teacup. Not the teacup, sorry, the teapot. Spit cake is a little different. When I was creating spit cake, my neighbors gave me all their wedding china because they didn't want to deal with hand washing their dishes anymore. Their marriage is still great. They just didn't want to deal with the high maintenance storage and care for their objects. So they handed me 40 pieces of china. 41, I have a broken one over here if anyone wants to look at it later. And when I was cutting it, I was thinking so much about these cakes on a spit that I learned about in Britain, France. I've never had one because you have to get the whole cake. You can't just get a piece of it. But it's battered, dripped on a spit that's turned next to a fire, and that's how it's made. And they're served, there's a version of it all over Europe, and they're served at special occasion events like weddings. And so when I was putting the form together, I could not stop thinking about this cake that I just secretly want to try. Someday I will. But when you're traveling, buying an entire cake is kind of overwhelming, right? Especially a wedding-sized cake for yourself. So this is a sort of process shot. So I do a lot of arranging things in my studio. Sometimes I'll clamp stuff together. Sometimes I'll use like a tacky material to kind of hold things in place. This is a photograph that was up in my studio while I was making this piece of a fountain that somebody just let freeze as it was running. I believe that's in Milford, Massachusetts, and no longer there. I looked for it every year until it was gone. But there's different, I'll just stack it in different iterations till it looks right to me as I'm working. And this is the iteration that you see in the museum now. It's sort of, I meant to put a slide of this in. You know that those, it's a toy for toddlers, young toddlers, where it's a sort of dowel and you put the rings on the dowel. That's exactly how this is put together. There's a steel base with a steel rod going up the center, and there's sections glued together that you drop on. The preparators at the museum probably are familiar, but moving to Winston-Salem, North Carolina. So I moved there in 2015 from Massachusetts. I grew up in Massachusetts. I have some southern roots, but there is a sort of cartoon idea of what the South is like when you're from the North. I'm sure you all have a cartoon idea of the North too. Everybody has this very distilled, kind of garish idea of where other places are, right? And so I was expecting this incredibly dramatic cultural shock for myself when I moved to Winston-Salem to teach at UNC School of the Arts. And it was quieter. You know, there was this, I know the sort of Confederate statue monument has been talked about, but this was 2015, and so it was something I'd never seen before coming from Massachusetts. And it was in downtown Winston-Salem next to the courthouse. They did take it down, but I was kind of catching that at the same time as the election in 2016, and that's when the culture shock happened. I think that was a national culture shock for many people. And I just didn't know how to process how I was feeling, how to put that into an artwork without stepping so far outside of my visual language of, you know, these domestic florals, like what was I thinking? How would I even talk about, you know, this rise in white supremacy, this rise in Confederate pride? Until I went, because I'm always shopping in junk shops, I'm always scouring different secondhand stores for my materials, and I found a full set of these commemorative Confederate plates at a junk shop, and it felt like a call to action. I have built a whole practice disrupting porcelainware with these craft skills that I've developed. I found porcelain domestic plates that were meant to be hung in your home and collected at the store. It felt like a perfect action for me to use my work to kind of get these feelings out. And I use this slide because I want you to see it's not just the objects themselves, but the packaging of the objects. So these were created in 1971. These were commissioned by the White House of the Confederacy and if you think about that timing, that's around the Civil Rights era, right? So they were commissioned by the White House of the Confederacy to print a limited edition, produce a limited edition set. Limited edition means rare. The certificates of authenticity also point to rarity, collectability, 24-karat gold outer rim. That also is a value signal. And they all came in an archival box with a information card telling you about the scene that you were purchasing. So these weren't only meant to be collected and held precious, but also to pass down. These were heirlooms. And so I think of them a little bit like Trojan horses, because what could be more innocent than a plate, right? And yet they have all of this messaging embedded within them. And I wanted to include this slide because this is May 2022. These plates are still circulating, and very proudly, and this was in a public library, this was in a public space, and I underlined words that basically are what I was just mentioning, but those signifiers of value, rarity, preciousness, to give them validity, right? So what I did, and some of you may have seen these at the North Carolina Museum of Art, they were not there too long ago. So I took all 10. You'll notice 2019 is far away from 2016 when I bought them. It took me a long time to figure out what to do, because I didn't want to only just do what I do. If I took all the material out, it would just be these empty circles in the middle of the plates. So I had to figure out a way to work with the imagery that was there. And so what I did was I cut all of the images of the war, you know, the soldiers, the weapons, the horses, and all of the images of the Confederacy out of the plates, and I ground them to dust. So under each plate of origin, there is a little framed collection of the dust that I had to sieve out of the water that I was cutting in. And I finally bought like actual sieves, I think, for cheese making to do this, because I am still working on the similar series. But I was taping stockings that I was cutting to a cup that I cut the bottom of and just pouring the water through and letting it dry. The process in the studio is sometimes not as clean and tidy as one imagines, right? So I also removed all of the imagery and language from the information cards as well, and to harvested those in their own little container, all gilded like the plates. And when I was making this work, I didn't know that so this was a protest work for me. This was a social critique, northerner in the South. I was aware of institutional racism, institutional, cultural elements that were embedded in the structure throughout the country. I knew it wasn't a North-South thing, but I learned, because I have a family who farmed in Virginia, I learned that I had family that fought and died for Pickett's charge, in Pickett's charge for the Confederacy. And so that changed how I thought about this work completely. It was no longer this removed kind of work of social critique. It was a reckoning. It was an awareness of my own place within these systems. And so one series didn't really feel like enough to me. And so I've collected another 20 plates that I've altered from a different collection. These were even later. I think these are made in the 90s, these transferware pieces. The illustrations are done by artist Mort Kunstler, who did illustrations of the entirety of the Civil War. But I've obviously focused on the Confederate collectibles. But he was a pulp artist, so he did illustrations for like men's magazines and pulp novel covers in the 50s. And so they're very vibrant, much different than the other series, which were more subdued. And so the contrast of the removal of the information, and they were all made from edge to edge of the plate, so I had to kind of do some different problem solving with how I was removing information. So you can see some of the stuff is cut completely out, and I focused on Lee and Jackson for who I was removing entirely, and then everybody else I ground down as almost like an etching. And you can see the dust from each one is underneath the plate of origin. Stonewall Enters Winchester is currently on view at Castle House. So if any of you want to go see that, it is available for viewing. And recently, several of these pieces were at the Nasher Museum. So this work I titled A Mightier Work is Ahead, which was after a Frederick Douglass speech that he made that felt very kind of, it felt very significant to our current situation, where he said, "But a mightier work than the abolition of slavery now looms up before the abolitionist. When we have taken the chains off the slave, as I believe we shall do, we shall find a harder resistance to the second purpose of this great association than we have found even upon slavery itself." Clearly, we were still living in those times. And I recently read, I can't remember the artist, but somebody wrote about why artists often kind of are working with historical content, and she said it's because there's still a lot of unfinished business in the past. And so I sort of feel that quite a bit with this series. And to kind of finish, before I change gears, I'll answer a question. Yes?
Just a quick question.
Yeah.
What was the technical process that the plate people did to produce the images on the plate? Is it sort of photo?
It's called transferware, so I don't know exactly how it is, but it's a glaze, like it is like a photo glaze where it's kind of heat transferred into the plate. So I'm assuming it's kiln fired into the plate, but it is like you kind of.
But it is a photo-based
Yeah.
process from a painted image?
Yeah. Yeah, so this one has the painted image and the sort of section pulled out of the painting. And these ones are also limited edition, but they were definitely factory produced, you know. So the edition is much larger than the Great Enemy of Truth series. So the edition, I think, is maybe triple what that series was. I have the numbers somewhere in my research, but not in front of me. But yeah, these were similarly done. These also had that kind of photo transfer process. So somebody did an illustration, and then that was then transferred onto the plates. That's a good question. You just kind of throw around words like transferware and just forget that not everyone thinks about these things. So I did want to finish. It's hard to transition from that series, but I did want to finish with other work that's on display in the area. So if any of you, not this piece, but it did come from this piece, where I've been thinking a lot about, so I'm thinking about the home, I'm thinking about these places of safety, these environments of safety, and how it feels more porous than ever right now, you know, from the pandemic to all of the unending images of climate crisis, war, you know, all of these sort of elements of the exterior infiltrating into these supposed impermeable walls. And so I refer to this kind of body of work as beautiful disasters. And so this was a piece that was the one with the video that directly preceded the installation that's now at the North Carolina Museum of Art, called "And You Did Not Even Know Enough to Be Sorry," which is a line that is pulled from a Mary Oliver poem called From the Book of Time. And this piece was an actual casting, so I'm wrapping objects with paper. So this is entirely paper. There is no tree, there is no chair. You will notice there's a lot of furniture in my work. I can't stop altering and putting furniture in things. There are no lamps, it's all paper. But that's it's a 13-foot tree limb. It looks like a little stick on the wall, because the wall's giant. But that 13-foot tree limb fell on our power lines during one of the storms. I had these neighbors with cedar trees that were no match for these storms that kept happening in our neighborhood. So I squirreled that away. I had it for 3 years, because cedar doesn't do anything, so I was able to keep it for that long. And then finally had a space big enough to install a paper version. So it weighs nothing. It weighs about 10 pounds. But it's a sort of scene of this branch crashing into the space. And so I'm thinking a lot about, like I said, these kind of the porousness of our environment. You know, and obviously the sort of like wild qualities of North Carolina and all the vines on everything, that sort of made its way in. I was also able to finally design and print my own wallpaper, which I've never done before. I've been altering wallpaper for years. I have a lot of opinions about wallpaper pattern. I never got to finally do it myself. And you can see the sort of top is a lot more lush. So this is the top here. That's the top of the wall. It's a lot more lush. And then as you go down the wall, it gets kind of brown and a little bit crusty and dried out. And then towards the bottom of the wall, which we are getting to, there's what I think of as a water line of kind of rotten foliage. So I was really obsessed with the idea of making wallpaper that died from the top down, this kind of idyllic floral damask that slowly died down the wall. And then was also had a tree crashing through it and all this other dramatic elements kind of coming in. And so I want to finish, just at time, I want to finish with something I read on the plane coming here today, but it was so perfect for what we're looking at here that I couldn't ignore it. So this is from Orwell's Roses. If you like George Orwell, If you like flowers, if you like Rebecca Solnit, if you like social critique, this book is wonderful. I really recommend it. But this is from a chapter called Beauty Problems. And she wrote, I often have thought that much of the beauty that moves us in the natural world, is not the static visual splendor that can be captured in a picture, but time itself as patterns, reoccurrences, the rhythmic passage of days and seasons and years, the lunar cycle and the tides, birth and death. As harmony, organization, coherence, pattern itself is a kind of beauty. And some of the psychic distress of climate change and environmental disruption in the shattering of this rhythm. The order that matters most is not the spatial, but the temporal. And I feel like my work lives in that temporal space a lot of the time. And so that was just like, yes, somebody sees me. So that is my talk. This is my lovely dog who we actually just had to say goodbye to 3 weeks ago. I don't have the heart to take her out of the talk yet. She was the best studio dog. Oh, she was so wonderful. But yeah, so if anyone has any questions, we do have some time for that. Also, ElizabethAlexanderStudio.com has a way that you can contact me. My email's there. There's a whole message thing. I don't know how it works, but it does. Things get to me. So, and if you see me around, you think of a question later, I'll be probably walking around campus, so feel free to just stop me and talk. But yeah, thank you so much.